Thank you very much, Ed. That was a very kind introduction. I'm delighted to be with you here today. I'm sure that our discussion on this panel is going to be very interesting and very thought-provoking. This panel has been framed as a forward-looking discussion on technology, work, and populism, and more precisely perhaps on whether current and expected changes in technology and work may drive an increase in nationalist and divisive populist sentiment. This is chart week for those of you who are following Maclean's, and I thought perhaps I might start with a little bit of data. Last summer, Ecos ran a survey of just over 5,500 Canadians to gauge whether a divisive form of populism might be able to emerge here in Canada. They asked Canadians about their support for a populist agenda that includes opposition to trade, more restrictive immigration policies, and distrust of elites. Now, just think for a moment, how many Canadians are you willing to bet were actually willing to sign up for that kind of agenda? It was, in fact, overall 1 in 5 Canadians who said that agenda sounded pretty good to them. Support was actually significantly higher among those who identified as poor or working class, and also among those who said that their financial situation was worse today than it had been 5 years ago. So looking ahead, is there reason to believe that projected trends will raise economic anxiety and drive up support for populism, even here in Canada? Here are a few more data points that I thought might be of interest to help us frame this conversation. There is significant debate about the share of jobs that are likely to be replaced by automation. One recent estimate suggested that 60% of occupations could see at least 30% of their component tasks automated by 2030. That unbundling of work is actually already happening on at least some 145 different online platforms that offer crowdsourced access to high-skilled labor from some 50 million participants, not just in our country, but also around the world. While Canadians, another data point for you, while Canadians may currently have their eye on NAFTA negotiations and the 25 to 50,000 or so jobs that may or may not hang in the balance, it's worth noting that global projections on growth are actually rather muted. And the IMF, in fact, is suggesting medium-term risks are, quote, still tilted to the downside. Finally, a recent OECD report concludes that many people feel that the benefits unleashed by openness and globalization are not reaching them, and that government is failing to respond. The same report finds that just 35% of adult Canadians feel that they have a say in what governments do. So according to some observers, we are approaching a precipice of sorts. And to help us sort through some of that precipice, we have 3 esteemed guests with us. David Dodge, former governor of the Bank of Canada. He's held senior positions in the Central Mortgage and Housing Corporation, the Anti-Inflation Board, the Departments of Employment and Immigration, Health, and of course the Department of Finance. He's now senior advisor at Bennett Jones. He also serves on the board of the Canadian Institute for Advanced Research and chairs the National Council of the C.D. Howe Institute. Armine Yalnizyan is a leading voice in Canada's economic scene. She has helped define the Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives, particularly their project on inequality, and served as their senior economist for many, many years. Armine provides regular business commentary on major media outlets, including CBC Radio's Metro Morning and On the Money. Armine is president of the Canadian Association for Business Economics, and she is also a member of the Government of Canada's Foresight Team on the Future of Work. Finally, Jonathan Rothwell, Gallup's senior economist, researches and publishes on a broad range of topics and advises Gallup clients and associates on research questions and economic analysis. Before joining Gallup, Jonathan was a fellow at the Brookings Institute Metropolitan Policy Program. His research is regularly featured in the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, and the Economist. He is the author of several studies, including Explaining Nationalist Political Views, the Case of Donald Trump. So I'd like to now welcome all of our guests to the stage. Okay, well, welcome. Thank you very much for being here today. We're going to be launching right into our conversation, but we, as Ed had mentioned, we also invite you in the audience to join in that conversation. We encourage you to use Slido The questions will be appearing up here, so we'll be able to draw on those for responses from the panelists. Just a reminder to use Slido. You download the app or you go on to slido.com and input the event code hashtag 6994, okay? So once you have that, you're in the meeting, you're good. And you can type in your questions, your comments, etc. À noter aussi que, bien que la conversation se dirige en anglais ici, nous vous invitons de soumettre vos questions et vos commentaires en français. Why don't we start by trying to understand the nature of the problem? And I think all three of you have a slightly different take on that. David Dodge, may I start with you? Are we talking, when we talk about technological change and automation, are we talking about something that is completely unprecedented? Is this disruption different from what we've seen before?
The short answer is no, so let's start with a little bit of history. You know, technological change and globalization have led to rising productivity and rising average income levels, and this has gone on for essentially 2 centuries, since the second half of the 19th century. And those rising income levels that come from productivity, however, have been accompanied with creative destruction. That's part of the game of getting the rising income levels. And during the transition period, because the change doesn't happen overnight, during the transition period, there is social disruption, there is economic disruption, and successful societies have found a way to manage that disruption. Better managed in the 20th century than the 19th or the 18th. So tech change really led to major increases in productivity, essentially in the 20th century, from the beginning of the 20th century to about the middle of the 1970s. And we had 3% per annum, a little bit more, improvement in productivity over that long period. A lot more than we had before that period, and a lot more than we've had since. But that led to very sharp increases in wages and profits, and to the expansion of markets through that period. And as the price of communication and transportation fell, to the physical expansion of markets. But the adjustment process was not straightforward. There was a change in the sectoral demand for labor, in the earliest one, from the farm to the factory. And then you had the rise of certain towns. If we think of the first industrial revolution, you had the rise of Manchester. So you had areas which were big winners, and you had areas which were big losers. And that has been true all through time, and remains true today. We have big winners from the ICT revolution, and the one we're now in, AI. Places like Silicon Valley are the big winners. The heartland of the United States, the big losers. So that, we've said that always through the piece. There's always been a change in the demand for skills. Sometimes upskilling, i.e. the requirement for more skilled people, and that professional and technical demand in the 20th century is a good example. On the other hand, other technology changes led to downskilling, the opening of major opportunities for less skilled people, the transition from crofters and hand weavers to machines is a good example of that one. So, and then finally, some of the technical revolutions have led to changes in capital share of income. That was certainly true in the 19th century, where the capital share of income rose. What was unique, actually, about the 20th century to from about 1917 to 1975 is capital share actually fell. So what we're seeing at the moment, have seen since 1975, is much more reminiscent, actually, of the 19th century. But adjustment takes time. There are winners and losers, as I've just said. And the other thing that has happened in technological change has often been that has led to concentration. That was certainly true if you think of the railroads or if you think of the oil industry. At the beginning of the 20th century, that is certainly true today if you think of Google and Amazon. And so policy, in a sense, has always had to cope with the balancing out of the winners and losers, dealing with the concentration issues that come up. And actually, we've been very successful, and we were most successful in dealing with this during the period of the most rapid technological change from the end of the Second World War until roughly the end of the 1970s. Those were the periods where we developed OAS, unemployment insurance, and so on. And that leaves the question, are those the mechanisms we use today, or is something like wage insurance much more important in dealing with the changes we have to deal with? We dealt with it through training and education, the upskilling side on education. We dealt with it through mobility. These are very important adaptive instruments we have to use today. And in particular, find a way to use cognitive tutors, to use AI to do some of the things that we've done in training and education by people before. And finally, as I said, we're going to have to find a replacement for the Sherman Act, something to deal with the concentration issues that come from big data. And that's an enormous challenge. So those, in a sense, are our challenges. We know there are going to be changes along the way. We know we've dealt with them before. There is virtually no job today that existed 100 years ago. So change has always been there. People change jobs roughly, 2% of the labor force changes every month. Right? So change is part of the system. And the public policy challenge is to facilitate that change so that the gains we get in productivity from technological change or from the expansion of the market, which is the geographic change, trade, those benefits that we get from the technological change actually get reasonably distributed in society so that there is not opposition to the change. That is the challenge that we face. We face today upskilling in terms of STEM skills, but we also have a big need for PSWs, which is a lower skill side. So we need to work on both sides, and that requires different mechanisms, and it requires social adaptation as well as we go through it. We're going to see the disappearance of a number of routine jobs, but the new jobs come along at the same time, so we'll downgrade the administrative jobs, if you will, the routine jobs, and we will have new and different ones that are very human. But we've got to be proactive in doing that to manage change, and we've got to figure out a way, as I said, to manage the extreme concentration which is coming from big data. Those are our challenges today in managing change in order to get the benefits from society going forward.
Okay. I'm a big fan of paying good attention to history to better understand how we got to where we are in terms of public policy. And Armine, you're engaged in a project that is also now looking quite far ahead in terms of foresight. Could you, kind of take us from where David left us off and talk a bit about how you see the technological disruptions effects in terms of inequality? What are the signals that you're seeing, that you're picking up, that you think we ought to be aware of and paying attention to?
Yeah, I can start with what you mentioned, Jennifer, which is that 60%, according to McKinsey, 60% of jobs will have up to 30% of their tasks automated in the coming years. And I just really want to reinforce that what we're talking about here is the distinction between jobs and tasks. How many tasks can be automated is different than how many jobs we will lose to automation. And McKinsey estimates that about 5% of all jobs will disappear as a result of automating 100% of their tasks. And you stop and think about that, sounds like, oh, that's terrible. No, remember two things. Number one, that we are only looking at job destruction because of automation. We are not looking at job creation because we don't know how to estimate that. The second point is that, does 5% sound really terrible to you? It's like hundreds of millions of jobs around the world. It sounds scary, yeah? In Canada, Statistics Canada did a great job of taking a look at what the birth and death is of jobs. And so between an average, which includes the great financial crisis period, an average between 2003 and 2015, in any given year, we lost 5.8% of our stock of jobs. But in any given year, we created 20% of the labor market, which is that's why the labor market continues to grow. We create more jobs than we kill. So there's more births than deaths in the number of jobs. So is this time different in terms of digital realities? And I would say I also am old enough to have gone through this 3 times in my life, that the robots are going to eat all of our jobs. Twice, it did not materialize. In fact, at the end of that conversation, one in the 60s and early 70s, one again in the 90s, which was more about global stagnation in job growth than it was in terms of the robots in particular, but it was the beginning of the PC era. At the end of both of those conversations, we had more jobs than we did when we started the conversation. So could this time be different? Well, indeed it could, for 2 reasons. Digital realities are unbundling our tasks that are done in our jobs. So increasingly, people don't have jobs, they perform tasks, and they can perform them digitally. So I take a look at what has happened in the wake of the GFC, the global financial crisis, and take a look at this rise of populism, which is all about somebody is gaining from the growth, but it ain't me. It's part of what you were talking about. Somebody else is getting something somewhere, and I'm being left behind. So Canada's got a very enviable track record thus far in the story of inequality in the last decade. But you have to remember, we're plateauing at a level of inequality that is far elevated from what it was in the mid-70s. So over the course of a generation, 2 generations, we're worse off in terms of inequality. And when you look at it through an intergenerational lens, even worse. So the thing that has saved our bacon in Canada and made us not look like the US, because nobody does extreme like the US when it comes to inequality, what made us better in Canada is higher labor force participation rates of women and the commodity boom. Well, we added about 50% to labor force participation rates of women over the course of the last few decades. We don't have another 50% to pour into the system. So we've played the women's card. One could argue we are close to maxing out playing the education and skills card, though I think we're playing that card the wrong way. And it's unclear that the commodity boom is going to return anytime soon. So we are starting to stare inequality in the face in a brand new way. And here's the problem with digital platforms, which unbundle tasks, where you are competing with the rest of the world for the same task. If you've got the same skills, the relevant labor market is global in nature, it's not local. So jobs are being destroyed in a place in time, and where the jobs are being created is on a global digital platform that knows no boundaries. I think we are on the precipice of looking at a very serious and rapid global rebalancing of wages, which is going to dislocate a lot of people. In the wake of the global financial crisis, and people are saying none of the fundamentals of that crisis have been really addressed, and we might very well be facing another financial crisis in the next few years. But even without, in the wake of that crisis, so many people's pensions got wiped out that people that are older felt that they had to work longer. And consequently, in the wake, so we've seen the biggest growth in labor force participation rates of those 55 years of age, 65 years of age, and older. In the wake of the crisis, the employment rate of our youngest Canadians has not gone back up. And guess what? The problem there is they're not in education either. The NILF category, not in the labor force, means you hope that there's more of them in education. And in fact, enrollment rates have gone up. But there's a bigger group than ever in Canada of people not in employment and not in education. That story has never gone down well in history. A bunch of people with nothing to do that are young and angry. So I'm a little bit worried about the future of the gig economy, and we haven't even touched on the impact, the disruptive impact that AI could have on not only automating brawn, but automating brain. And we're into a brand new world order, I think, that it behooves us. I really appreciate being invited to talk about what we can do about these things. And that we've gathered today is a really good sign, because that's the problem we're facing.
I'd also like just to note that both David Dodge and Armine Yalnizyan both flagged the issue of inequality and concentration and distributional outcomes. I think this might be worth noting just for the history books, that this has been shared perspective on the stage. And I want to pick up on that theme and turn to you, Jonathan, because that issue of having winners and losers and the perception that somebody else is benefiting from the system and I'm not, and I'm angry about that. You've started to look at what are the political consequences of that, and certainly there's been a dominant narrative in the U.S., but I would say more widely, right? Look at overseas at Brexit, that growing numbers of citizens are feeling that anxiety personally, of slower growth, economic disruption, feeling displaced, less hopeful about the future, and that they're taking it out in the ballot box. But I think your analysis suggests that the picture is maybe a little bit more complicated. And I wonder if you could walk us through some of your work there.
Yeah, sure. So the dominant narrative with respect to who supports Donald Trump in the United States, but more broadly, as you say, who supported Brexit, who supports far-right candidates in Europe, is that it's people who have been disproportionately harmed by globalization or maybe even automation. And so I've been able to access Gallup's immense polling data to help answer this question, look at it in some detail. And first I'd say there's direct evidence we have from surveys that people who support or have favorable views of Donald Trump are not especially worried about either losing their job overseas or through automation. So some direct questions. Just 6% of employed adults who approve of Mr. Trump say they're worried about their job going overseas, compared to 11% who do not approve of him. And on automation, 9% who support him are worried that their job will become obsolete as a result of technology, versus 15% who don't approve of him. But looking in more detail at less direct evidence, it tells the same story. So for example, Trump won manufacturing sector workers by a significant margin, about 13 percentage points. But then what you have to take into account is that the people who work in the manufacturing sector in the United States tend to be older, white, Christian males living in rural or less urbanized areas. And Trump and Republicans historically have done very well with that demographic, whether they work in manufacturing or whether they're lawyers or doctors or work in any other sector of the economy. And so when you adjust for those demographic factors, there's a very, very thin margin in terms of support among manufacturing workers. And then if you look at other factors that can go in, we can get into that too. But that's also true when I've looked at far-right, support for far-right parties in Europe, which have grown in prominence in a number of countries. There's just not much of a relationship between manufacturing exposure and support for those parties. So I think there's got to be other things going on. And I think it's really important to distinguish between people holding views, sometimes very passionate views, in this case, negative views about trade and immigration, without assuming that they themselves have been disproportionately harmed in their personal lives by those things. Obviously, politics is very complex. For example, people hold passionate views on the minimum wage in the United States at the city level, at the state level. That doesn't mean they've necessarily worked in a minimum wage job or have a family member who works in a minimum wage job. People hold passionate political views for a number of different reasons, without it coming through their individual lives. So I think the implication is that if we're talking about addressing concerns that people have with trade and immigration, it might not be enough to satisfy them to protect them from displacement from job loss.
So let me just probe a little because I want to make sure I understand this. If they themselves are not actually directly impacted, what is driving their distrust of trade, their negative views and opinions on immigration? Where is that, if it's not that they are personally more exposed and financially more insecure that because of those forces, where is this all coming from?
Well, it's a difficult question. The best answer that I've been able to come up with are that there are two major factors that have been brought to bear. Some are the ones that we've mentioned. So declining productivity growth, GDP per capita growth is a major issue in the United States. And it's been combined with very rapid rise in income inequality, the fastest rise in income inequality among OECD countries, at least outside of Latin America. Really extraordinary growth in inequality. And so those forces, slow growth, high inequality leads to wage stagnation for middle-class families, some maybe even decline for a significant number of them. And so that's the general macroeconomic story that's going on. That combined, I think, with the somewhat unique legacy of the United States of both slavery and Jim Crow oppression of African Americans that went very far into the 20th century, created a set of narratives and atmosphere that was more suspicious of minority groups than maybe you'd see in Canada and other European countries. And when you ask people directly questions about the concerns about race, and I can read the exact wording just to clear what I'm talking about here. People who say they have a favorable view of Donald Trump are much more likely to say, to disagree with the statement, I'm angry that racism exists. White people in the United States have certain advantage because of the color of their skin, much less likely to agree with those questions, much more likely to agree with questions like, I find myself fearful of people of other races, and racial problems in the United States are rare, isolated situations. And I also found, looking at the zip codes of people who have favorable views of Trump, and even distinguishing between Republican Party supporters who do and do not have a favorable view of Trump, if they live in racially isolated areas with fewer minorities, they're much more likely to hold a favorable view of Trump. So it tends to be Americans who have less educational attainment, that's certainly a factor, and that taps into economic anxiety and stress, and makes them more likely to have not benefited from some of the rising technology and the advancement of professional industry jobs. Living in rural areas, living in areas that are fairly isolated from minority groups and actually further away from the Mexican border. I found that proximity to the Mexican border reduces support for Trump. And living in communities that are not exposed to global trade, frankly. The communities that have manufacturing are no more likely to support Trump and actually somewhat less likely to support Trump. And I think that's particularly true for, I found that to be true for computer electronics manufacturing, which has been heavily exposed to imports from China. And so, yeah, I think in some ways, it's sort of political culture combined with the very poor macroeconomic conditions that are creating very high elevated rates of anxiety and financial insecurity among people who support Trump. And I've seen that among far-right supporters in Europe as well. So there certainly are economic issues at play, but the channel is not as clear and direct as it's often portrayed.
Okay, thank you. I'm being prompted on the monitor here to remind you about the opportunity to engage and ask questions or make some comments to the panel by using the Slido app or going onto the website. The hashtag again for this particular event is 6994. I'd like to put another question to the three panelists and pick up actually on what you said, Jonathan, in terms of macroeconomic conditions. David Dodge, you have long warned about Canada's level of productivity. Does the current climate and the future prospects in terms of automation that you talked about, does that leave you more or less optimistic about Canada's future productivity?
Well, unfortunately, what's happened is that U.S. productivity has fallen to Canadian levels, so we don't actually look quite so bad now, relatively, as we were before. So what about going forward? Is the new technology likely to assist us in getting that productivity up? Are we going to reach out and grab the opportunities that come from it or not? I can't really answer that definitively, except what I think we're observing, if we look at what's happening in Montreal, in Toronto, and Vancouver, and to a certain extent in Edmonton, we really are seeing at least the first really strong green shoots of firms that are emerging in the new technology space that are globally oriented. Their market is the globe. And so I guess I am more optimistic about our ability to seize the gains that are going to come from the new technologies, because the firms that are engaged in that are looking outward, whereas in the past, as technology changed, often we were looking inward to our own internal market, and we could never realize the full benefit. So I have to say I'm a little more optimistic about our ability going forward. Now, whether collectively we in North America and whether collectively we in the Western world are going to be able to seize the gains that are going to come from this, or whether they're going to all accrue in rents to the few organizations who own the data, which you and I give away free every time we check that little box, I agree. We have tremendous concentration of firms that actually have access to those data. And so the potential for rent-seeking behavior of those large organizations is huge. And we are going to have to figure out, and there's no indication whatsoever that the Americans are even interested in figuring out the answer to this question. We're going to have to figure out some way to deal with it. The Europeans are interested but incapable. The Chinese are interested and capable. The Americans are totally disinterested. And we're pretty small, so unfortunately we live in North America in that regard.
Armine, you had a fantastic contribution to the Maclean's Chartapalooza that looked at the worker share of the economy. And I wondered if you could talk a bit more about some of the concerns you've expressed around the bargaining power of workers. That if this is the new reality, we've got concentration, we've got rent seeking, and this is not just happening here in Canada, this is a global phenomenon. Could you talk a bit more about some of the issues that you're tracking in that space?
Yeah, it actually builds really nicely on to the comments that David was making about corporate concentration on the one hand, but also these globe-straddling corporate titans that are operating almost like public utilities. There are competition for every one of those corporations that are in what's called the FAGMA, Facebook, Amazon, Google, Microsoft, and Apple. There's competition for all of their products, but they're the biggest in the market space, and they're eating up all of their competitors, and they're bigger than any corporations we've seen before in history, globally. And they are harder to regulate and harder to tax and create fewer jobs per dollar earned than any corporation we've seen before. So we are looking at a dynamic that is driven by the technology in part, that does tend to concentrate the benefits in the hands of a very small number of people. We are looking at a 30, 35-year social experiment in trickle-down economics, which deems that the market is better than governments at allocating resources and distributing product and setting a social wage. And reversing those tendencies is going to be very challenging. That chart you were talking about, Canada, again, is an outlier. though in the last 30 years we've followed a global pattern of a smaller share going to workers. And by the way, if you look at that data, you will see that if you include pensions and benefits, it looks like we're holding the line. But what's the really important part of this worker share to look at is what proportion of GDP is going to workers, not to pensioners. These are old deals that we're seeing in that side of the workers' compensation package. And they're going to run their course because we've moved from defined benefit to defined contributions. So looking at the wage share, the wage and salary share of the economy, you see that over time, Canadian workers have gotten a smaller piece of the pie that they help create. And that's everybody from the lowest workers to the highest CEOs. But in the last few years, it's kind of stabilized, and it's kind of stabilized with a lot of variation. It's stabilized in part because the profit share has shrunk in Canada. And that is partly because of this huge volatility in commodity prices. So that's a chart to watch because of the relationship between profits and wages at any given moment in time in the creation of GDP. And I actually think that there are ways to improve that wage share, but it might be also in the nature of how we create a social wage. In other words, how many products and services do we offer our citizens and our residents that takes the bite of income, like the problem of the cost of the basics, whether that's post-secondary education or healthcare or childcare or housing or public transit, and actually decommodifies it to some degree so your income isn't as important. So there are many ways of redistributing the benefits of a growing GDP, and I think we're going to have to start tending to that.
I'm going to actually turn to one of the questions that was posed through Slido. This is apparently currently the top question. So one of the ways that you can actually promote your question is having other people like it. This is sort of interactive that way. Okay, so this is the current question, and I'm going to try and synthesize this. So and I'm going to put this to the whole panel, but maybe Jonathan, I can ask you to respond first because I think there's a good hook in here for you. Are the gainers in this new economy willing to help the losers? In Trump's US, it seems the answer is no. So maybe Jonathan, you could respond to that part of the question, and then Armine and David, I would ask you to talk about your read on the situation in Canada.
Well, yeah, one approach to this question would be to say, well, who are the gainers? If you think broadly about it, well, it would be highly educated people with at least a four-year college degree, working in professional services. That's the job industries with the largest growth. Those are the people that have been doing well. Those people tend to be some of the more liberal people in the United States, most willing to support welfare redistribution and the traditional left policies. Silicon Valley is even fairly liberal in its politics typically. So I think the direct answer is the gainers do seem to be willing to support those who are losing. But honestly, I'm less worried about inequality driven through technological progress because there's a great benefit with technological progress, and that lowers prices for everyone else and raises their living standards and purchasing power. What I am very concerned about is inequality that comes not through technological progress, but through lobbying-induced regulations that create inefficiencies and don't result in prices falling like they have for computer technologies and software. But if you look at the areas where there's the most 1% income earners in the US, it's only a very small percent that are in IT and software and so on. Most of it is doctors, lawyers, professional services, and finance. That's basically where most of the top income inequality has gone, to people in those categories. Often, in healthcare, for example, prices have skyrocketed, and now US went from 9% of GDP going to healthcare to 18% from 1980 to 2015. Huge number of people in hospitals, physicians benefiting from that. So that's the kind of inequality that isn't driven through technology, actually lack of technology. They're not driving down prices through implementing technology. That's what I'm really concerned about.
Okay. Armine and David, could I ask you to talk about your read on the Canadian scenario? Are the winners going to be willing to help with that?
I think you have to answer that in two ways. First of all, it's not just income inequality. Actually, income inequality is very high in California and very high in New York. But those are the Democratic voters. And why? Because overall incomes are very high. The big problem is when we have areas, local areas, that are in sharp decline, and everybody in that area feels it. It's not just the steel worker that gets thrown out of work or the coal miner that's out of work. It's everybody that feels it. And so there is a big local problem, a big set of local problems that we face. In this country, we have over time put some emphasis on place. And so compare Cape Breton with the coal area of Pennsylvania. Both were supported by industries and supported well by industries that are dead or dying. We have supported Cape Breton, and it is now making the transition. Southern Pennsylvania, normally Democratic, who ended voting heavily Republican in this one, got no support. The area is dying. So I think it's not just income distribution up and down the scale, but there's a geographic dimension to it that's very important that we really haven't mentioned today.
Okay. Armine, can I turn to you?
Yeah, just briefly. I mean, if you go back to the idea that the wage and salary share of the income pie is shrinking, and you're asking for more redistribution in a shrinking part of what is being created, it puts your eye to the part that is growing, which is the corporate side. But we have a very actually redolent experience recently of trying to go after the CCPCs, for example, the Canadian-controlled private corporations, and saying this is an unfair way of sheltering for a small group of those people, an unfair way of sheltering their incomes from taxation after they've maxed out all their other tax shelters, to have yet another form of tax shelter, which created this huge blowback. So I would say even in Canada, amongst the rich and the poor, there is some indication that the rich feel entitled to their entitlements, as somebody once famously said in this country. And so I think the issue becomes, how do we appropriately and collectively, not just as one nation, but as a bunch of nations, align our tax policies to minimize profit shifting, which is what the OECD BEPS process is, the Base Erosion and Profit Shifting Initiative that was started in 2012. That is a tough, admittedly tough process, because it requires nation states actually aligning tax policies to prevent this Grecian formula, which is, catch me if you can.
But I think there's one other issue, though. There's the corporate personal issue, but we have a problem here, that we have rammed up our personal tax rates on people, the very people we want to attract to create the wealth and the new technology. Not the rich, the people who would like to be rich. We have rammed up those rates very high. And so we have to be extraordinarily careful in this country in thinking about this, to ensure that we are continuing to provide incentive for the people who want to get there to be able to get there. And our personal rates, our personal tax rates, at a high level start relatively low in the income scale. And those are precisely the folks that are going to add to the productivity and add to the wealth of the country. So we have to be careful on that side.
Jonathan, you had a really terrific article in the New York Times recently, and I wondered if we could get you to talk a little bit about one of the points you were making there, which was this idea of there being, it's not so much the 1%, but the doctors, the professional services that you were talking about, right, who have been able to benefit from certain domestic policies. Looking forward, how optimistic are you vis-a-vis the willingness of sort of that maybe, top 20%, I think you were estimating, who are kind of benefiting from that captured economy. How optimistic are you that they might be willing to change?
Well, I think that it's up to the rest of the economy and citizens to force them to change. I don't think people are going to, who are in a specific industry or occupation that benefits from regulations that their lobbying associations have created, are going to disarm, in effect, and give up their advantages. I don't think we should expect that. I do think we could put together a coalition of citizens that recognize that in this industry, in this occupation, there are certain laws that, if reformed, would be beneficial to the general public, and go about tackling those. And I think that the encouraging thing to me is that it's not really a right-left issue. There, on the one hand, the Republican Party, while has not traditionally been supportive of aggressive efforts to make the distribution of income more egalitarian, has been skeptical about the role of government in creating problems in the economy, while the left has been more traditionally focused on the egalitarian promoting policies, but usually sees transfer payments as the way to do that. But I think there has been increasingly, has actually been some agreement that efforts to make markets work better could benefit in terms of the population, in terms of the income distribution, and satisfy multiple constituencies.
We've talked a little bit about tax policy, about regulatory policy as avenues for change, but somebody on Slido wants to ask about education and skills. And David, you had mentioned pressures vis-a-vis upskilling, and Armine, the question is actually phrased specifically to you, but maybe I can invite all the panelists to respond. Armine, you said that you feel that perhaps we've maxed out on education and skills as a means of growth. Could you talk a little bit about that a little bit more, and then maybe I can invite both Jonathan and David to respond.
Sure. What I was talking about is, I'm of that era of social policy work where I knew Arthur Kruger pretty well, and Arthur Kruger's great line was, if you think education isn't a solution, try ignorance. So education is a solution, but education and training itself does not create jobs. So we're seeing people investing huge amounts of money and time to get what they think is their pass into the good life, and not having a job at the end of it. So it's not a job guarantee. Education and training is not a job guarantee, number one. Number two, the statistics show us increasingly, as more people get high education, post-secondary education, that the wage premium for having such education is falling to practically zero. But the job premium maintains its value in the sense of access to a full-time job. So it's not even getting a job, it's the proportion of people with post-secondary education that have got a full-time job. Your chances are much better of having a full-time job if you've got post-secondary education. So you are more likely to win in that lottery. But again, it's not a guarantee, and increasingly after the GFC, we're seeing this kind of wasteland of people that have spent fortunes to get themselves marketable and ready and not being hired. So it does raise questions about how much more can you tell people to get education and training if they can't deal with the student debt because they can't get a job. And maybe we need to be rethinking how we're credentializing people and preparing them and what it is that employers are looking for. Can you give it to workers either through more on-the-job training or through more short-term training modalities that are more targeted to what employers are apparently looking for and can't find.
David, could I ask you to pick up on the same point here about upskilling and the balance between workers and employers?
I think there are two things here. First of all, it's not a question of going to university and that's it. It's a lifelong process, and we're all, regardless of our age, we have to keep relearning and learning new things, number one. And number two, we have not yet made very good use of cognitive adaptation learning from machines. AI actually points a way forward there in an incredible way. So I don't think I think the education learning issue is as big as it ever was. It's just different. And it's not a question of just keeping people incarcerated in educational institutions for longer and longer and longer. It is an issue of giving people the tools to continue to learn the new skills as the world changes. And I think we're a long way, there's a lot of room for improvement on that front. Holding people in the little red brick schoolhouse for longer and longer, I think is probably not a very good idea, and it's probably an especially bad idea for boys.
Interesting. As a university prof, I like this idea of incarceration. That's a nice analogy. I'll use that one with my students. Jonathan, there's been some attention around almost a culture war kind of perspective in terms of the treatment of higher education in the U.S. Yep. Could you talk a little bit about your views or what you're seeing in terms of this reliance on higher education and upskilling and as the way to respond to technological change and this disruption?
Well, one major problem in the United States is that higher education has to some extent become polarized, and now it's almost viewed as something that only liberals will want. Not only does our polling data suggest that Republicans and conservatives are much more hostile toward higher education in terms of the satisfaction with it, but we also see in our polling data, if you ask white Americans, particularly white male Americans, whether or not they feel they need more education to advance in their career, even if they have not gone to college, they're hugely more likely to say no than any other group, whether it's white females, whether it's Asians, Hispanics, blacks, just massive differences in what they perceive as the value of higher education for them. Now, part of that is they're making higher salaries without having gone to college through careers that may include in the construction industries and the skilled trades. One of my takes on what could be done, particularly at the high school level, is to create better career technical training opportunities. Really make high school more relevant. High school is failing in many important respects to prepare people for anything close to a meaningful career at this point. The assumption is that it's just preparing people to go to college, but we know that 66% of people aren't going to go to college. And even for people that do go to college, they could be learning something that might be relevant to their career while they're in high school. So, for example, Virginia Beach in Virginia has a really interesting program where every high school student in the school district can enroll at a community college and study robotics and study Cisco network programming, take advanced computer and IT courses, and this can lead to immediately attractive skills where they can get relatively high-paying jobs in their late teens, early 20s, or they can take those skills and then go study whatever they want at a four-year program. And I think that's the kind of thing that we need to see more of.
So education reform back on the U.S. agenda.
Yeah, it needs to be at all levels, but that's just one example.
Okay. I'm going to take another question from Slido. This is an interesting one because it picks up on some of the points you were making, Jonathan, about how the Silicon Valley massively progressive and whatnot. We're actually seeing a universal basic income pilot being tested there. We have one here in Ontario right now. And the question from Slido is, with inequality on the rise in Canada, could universal income become a viable and realistic part of the solution? So if the robots are taking some portion of the jobs, and as David mentioned, perhaps some of our social programs, EI, for example, CPP, that were created for a different kind of reality, we're wondering whether or not they're the right tools. Do we need to start looking at UBI as the response? And I'm just going to put it to all three of you on the panel. To who would like to jump in first on that?
Well, first of all, we've experimented back in 1960s, 1970s at Manitoba. We experimented with that. We know actually quite a bit about this. We don't, need to say we got to experiment more and more. We actually know something about it. And we've also run, of course, a universal basic income program for everybody 65 and over. So this is not something new. I think what is really difficult here, and why I'm not sure that that is the answer to the adjustment problem that we face, is, and this has come out in our discussion so far, we're taking a 50-year-old or a 40-year-old person that earned $40 an hour, $50 an hour as a steel worker, as a miner, or as a skilled worker in the factory or on the construction site. And we're saying to that person, usually it's a him, we want you to accept something now at $15 an hour. So that's a big jump down. Not only is it a jump down in wage, and I think the way to manage that jump down in wage is to think about wage insurance as opposed to unemployment insurance. And that's not easy to run, but it's certainly much more imaginative way to deal with the problem. But we have a social problem there as well, because it's not just the cut in income that's there, it is the move from a man's job to a woman's job. And so there's a real social adjustment problem that is very hard to deal with. And so we have to think both in the economic dimension, and I think wage adjustment is the right way to think in that. But I think we have to think in the social dimension as well, and we have to think for that person. But I think, as Jonathan said, we also have to think about the high school, the boy in high school, whereas in the old days we stuck him in the army, and that was the adjustment process. We don't have that anymore. We're not going to stick them in the army. So we need to have something that allows for a transition into producing something, even if it's going to be an orderly in the hospital, that is acceptable to the person coming out. And I think we do have a big problem there, and we have had it for a while, and it is showing up in the fact that boys don't go on to university in the numbers that they used to. They don't complete high school because it's boring. And so these are the areas, but this is much more social rather than economic. My economic one, I can see a way forward. The social one, that's for everybody else to figure out.
Armine, you've talked about UBI as being a potential way forward. Do you want to respond to the question from the audience member?
Well, I have to say I'm one of these progressives that actually doesn't see UBI as the answer that people think it is, because I am also an economist. And I see no way of financing this at anything other than a guaranteed annual poverty rate, and maybe not even that, for the long haul. And as the wage share of the economy declines, if it does that, or as inequality within the wage share of the economy grows, you're asking for people to pay more, and the people that are paying taxes to pay more and more for something that they will never see part of. So that is not a durable, political, sustainable solution. And if you think the big corporations are going to pay for our UBI, like I want to have whatever it is you're smoking. So I think UBI isn't the solution, because I don't think the problem is an income problem at its heart. I think it is, what do I do with myself? What is my purpose? How do I fit in? All of the social problems you were talking about, where do I belong? We're moving into a very existential period of what is my meaning in life, and whether it is I live in Cape Breton, or I live in Wawa, or I live in Kitchener, Waterloo, or downtown Toronto. How do I fit into the world in which I move and breathe and exchange with people? So part of me says that the way you build durable and solidaristic responses to this huge upheaval that we're going through is to decommodify, man. Like take some of what we are doing and make income less important, not more important. Our basic income solution is like, say, it's just another way of saying, I'm going to give you tax cuts and put more money in your pocket. It's like, I don't know how much money I'm going to make from one month to the other if I'm a gig worker. But I've got a rent that does not change every month. So how can we create more affordable housing stock in this country? How can we make sure that the child care that my children need isn't like a question of, can I get it or can't I get it? I don't know how much money I've got this month. How do I put myself in a position where I can get the training that I need, but I'm not going to go bankrupt or get so deep into student debt that I'm never going to do anything else than pay off my student debt with whatever jobs I can find. So I think there are ways that you can build a social wage with the tax system that we've got that is less income focused and more basic service focused, in which everybody can imagine, even if we're paying more, we're getting something out of it. Everybody's getting something out of it. We have each other's back.
Jonathan, Armine said that people who might be hoping that corporations will pick up the tab for a UBI would be dreaming in Technicolor, and I tend to agree, by the way. But interestingly enough, in the States, the UBI pilots have actually been corporately funded. And here we are in Canada having a discussion, a debate talking about wage insurance and public funding for job training and access to childcare. Are Canada and the US on two different planets when it comes to our responses on this?
Maybe hard to know. I mean, I think part of it is people who from tech industry are doing very well, and they're trying to come up with ideas, and that's one that has occurred to them. But I agree with what you're saying, that it's not a sustainable solution politically. It's not clear it solves the most important social issues, which really aren't just being a recipient of a benefit, a welfare benefit. That's not what people strive for. They don't say, I want to grow up and get an unemployment insurance benefit. They want to accomplish something and be actively involved in society, and that's clear in our data. We track measures of subjective health and life and how people evaluate their lives, and when they're working, it's clear that they evaluate their lives in a much higher way, much closer to what they imagine is their ideal life. So I'd rather, I think, maintain transfer payments, maybe ramp them up where needed, but I'd much rather see focus on empowering individuals to participate in this economy and participate in future economies, and making sure that markets are working effectively and not undermining common workers and citizens by, for example, raising the price of our housing much more than it needs to be. Just to give one example, there's been some attention in the United States on zoning laws recently. In Silicon Valley, you can go to San Jose, and a tiny fraction, which is one of the most expensive places in the world, of course, but any developer would love to build apartment complexes, townhouses to help meet the demand for housing there. Turns out you can't because of regulations. There's only a tiny fraction of land that's even available for housing. And then within that, there's only a very, very tiny fraction, like 5% or so, that's available for multifamily housing. So those are the kinds of things that could be fixed that would help solve some of these problems.
And you put a tax on softwood lumber.
So
But you're not bitter, right?
I know we've sort of talked a bit about possible policy responses, and I do want to come back to that. But I also want to acknowledge that we've had a lot of engagement through the Slido question, so I want to come back to one of those. And this one is a question more about diagnosis and regional distribution of risk. So maybe all three panelists could respond. What regions, and maybe Jonathan, you can talk about states, Armine and David, you can talk about Canada. What regions do you think are most at risk, and how do we help? Who would like to go first on that one?
Well, we know that in this country. So we have here in this province, we have Eastern Ontario and we have Southwestern Ontario that are at risk because they have the old industries, number one, and number two, because they are low density, right? we've known for years we had risk in the low density maritime provinces in this country, and we've tried to deal with that slowly over time at some expense. So we kind of know the areas where there's risk. In the cities, in our major metropolitan areas, the adjustment can take place because people don't necessarily have to move. And the adjustment takes place reasonably well. It would be better if we had better transit systems, but takes place reasonably well in those areas. It doesn't take place very easily in the towns and the more dispersed part of the country. So that we know, and the question is, how do we, over time, facilitate the shrinkage of some parts, and we don't have to, and facilitate the housing. You mentioned the housing. Facilitate the housing in the growing metropolitan areas, which ends being important if we're going to continue to attract people and the industries into those areas. So I think we actually know quite a bit about it. How we deal with it is less easy.
Armine, are there any other regions that David hasn't talked about, or types of communities that you would see in Canada as being more at risk?
Yeah, so I'm going to say there's 3 types of risk that we're dealing with. The first, and perhaps by any one of our definitions on what is risky in life, would be not all, but too many reserves. First Nations reserves are some of the riskiest places to be born into in this country, and that is fixable. That is absolutely fixable, but we have dragged our feet too long on that. It has nothing to do with technology or the rest of it. Like, it's just how we take care of one another and how we perceive what public policy's goal should be. The second, and I would echo what David's saying about a lot of what's happening in countries all over the world is people are going from small communities to big cities because that's where they perceive the opportunities to be. So all over the world, we're dealing with depopulating parts, huge tracts of land that are depopulating, leaving behind people that are very poor or very old, but with aging infrastructure and very poor access to service and a lot of poverty. So here, that raises a lot of questions. You were talking about people getting out of high school and becoming an orderly in a hospital. We have a caring economy that is not going to be technologically replaced immediately. There's a lot of caring work. The question is, how much of that caring work is paid versus unpaid? So there's a whole way of mining that depopulation and, just even maintaining infrastructure so that as people can't afford to live in the big cities, there's some place for them to go back to or out to. And finally, I would say one of the riskiest regions of our country in Canada is the most densely populated cities. Why? Because they are the most densely populated. If the digital economy unfolds the way we think it might and adds to more and more job precarity so that more and more people don't know if they can put a roof over their head from month to month in the biggest cities, we've got very risky situations, very stressed out communities. It isn't just the stock of housing, it's can you even hang on to the housing you've got, and that has a lot to do with how precarious your income is, and that has a lot to do with the pace of technological change.
Jonathan, how about the US? What does the geographic distribution of risk look like there? Do you have the same rural-urban divides that David was talking about, or actually even the same sort of concentrated risk in urban centers that Armine was talking about?
Both. So within big cities, there are huge divides. America is famously a segregated city, not only by race, but also by economic income. And there are historic policies that created that, and then there are contemporary policies that maintain it. Zoning is one of them. So that is a major problem, and one of the ways it plays out is not only in access to jobs, but access to high-quality education at young ages. So that's a huge challenge. But when you compare major metropolitan areas to rural areas, particularly those that have lost population, there's a real challenge for the areas that have seen population decline. And interestingly, in some of those places, people are able to move out and do well, and there's been some fabulous analysis by an economist named Raj Chetty and Nathaniel Hendren looking at IRS data and seeing which communities in the United States are sort of launching people into upward mobility. And in many cases, it is rural places, but the problem is the people that are left behind, not so much the young people who are leaving and going to university. And so and you can also distinguish rural places from those that have a university where there are educated people who might be starting businesses and adapting to new industry demands versus those that don't and previously relied on manufacturing or mining that is not coming back. Those are the places that are, I think, where there's real challenges in terms of how to help those people.
But I thought that the entire, idea of the rise of the digital economy and knowledge-based economy was that it was going to be less important about where you were working, right? That part of our response in Atlantic Canada was to encourage communities to embrace things like call centers, right? That if I'm a digital task worker, it doesn't matter as long as I've got an internet connection and a laptop. I could be working in rural Nebraska, no problem. So, and I'm trying to pick up here on a question from the slideo here. Does the technological disruption that we're experiencing, should we actually be expecting those smaller communities to become larger? Is the rural community, are they likely to grow? And in turn, is that likely to then have an impact in terms of political landscape? Do you want to start with that one?
Yeah, I could take a crack at that. It's a really interesting thought. And there's been some debate in the urban economics literature about why this hasn't happened, why cities still matter to the extent they do. And I think a big part of it is that cities are where people trade. And it's not international trade, but they trade services all the time. And if you're a professional, you go to meetings, you work with other people. If you're a professional service provider or you're advanced industry, you have lawyers, you have accountants who might not be working for you, but you need to interact with them frequently. So there are real, for whatever reason, there are huge advantages, it seems, from working in cities, even today. To what extent that will change going forward is unclear. In principle, you could imagine people leaving expensive, overpriced cities and moving further and further out to the suburbs to work remotely. I can see some colleagues and people I know that have adopted that kind of lifestyle, and in some ways that would be very helpful, both maybe to the communities that had lost population before and take off some of the pressure of cities. So I hope that kind of thing happens more, but we just haven't really seen it as a major trend, I would say.
What about
Of course, some of those communities were only there because the natural resource was there. They are not really lovely places to live anyway, so that it's tough.
That is right.
If you're in a coal mining community, you were there because of the coal mines, not because it was a beautiful place to live
Not for the
or
weather?
a great place to live. So we have to be a little bit careful. And isolation is very difficult to deal with. The isolated communities, whether they are reserves, whether they were isolated mining communities, it's very hard to deal with those when the economic raison d'etre is not there. And in the past, we allowed mining communities to die. We're less willing to allow the communities to die, and we're less willing to allow the reserve to die. After all, we created those in the first place.
Yeah, I guess for me, I think it's less important where we live. I've been hearing this, you could work from anywhere with the digital reality for about 20 years, and these cities just get bigger and bigger. People go to not only where other people are, because we are, after all, pack animals, and we want to be, see and be seen by other people, and it's also where the markets are the biggest. So it isn't just job opportunities, it's where people are spending money, and wherever people are spending money, you've got a big market, you're going to go to where the big market is, you're going to get your biggest crack at being able to make an income when there's a lot of people there. I think the ability to move to a smaller place to do your work, to relieve pressure on the cities, is predicated on you having a job in the first place, because those smaller communities don't have the jobs. So if you got a job from someplace else and you choose to work digitally through telepresence someplace else, awesome. But what the digital world is doing is not providing jobs, they're providing tasks. And given that they are providing tasks, and the world, we are competing with the rest of the world, whether you're a lawyer, an accountant, this is going right up the skill spectrum to all the things that you tell your kids, unless you tell your kid to become a dentist. That is very difficult to do from a telerobotic point of view, but almost everything else, legal, accounting, engineering, the world is now the reality. So it's nice to talk about digital realities let you live anywhere, but frankly, they let you work from anywhere, which means everybody's your competitor. So there's a whole new complexion to that. Oh, you can work from someplace else. So unless you've got a job, it's very difficult to live in a small community. And I think that's why we're not going to see a renaissance of small communities anytime soon.
Okay. I'm being prompted here that it's time to wrap up. I just wanted to acknowledge it's been an incredibly wide-ranging conversation, looking at past, present, and future, looking at Canada, the US, and global trends. And I just wanted to invite the audience now to join me in thanking our panelists today. So, and now I have the honor of inviting Anne-Marie Hubert, who is the board chair of the Public Policy Forum, to come to the podium and say a few words. Thank you.
Wow. Jennifer, you were brilliant. What a fascinating conversation. Lots of insight for us to think about as we grapple this topic, the implications of technology, work, and populism. Merci à nos panélistes qui ont fait un travail extraordinaire. David Dudge trying to get us to think that he would not be involved in social issues with all the comments he made on stage, eh? But I think Jennifer asked the question, are we going to grab the opportunity ahead of us with those disruptive technologies? I think it's the responsibility of everyone in this room to figure out how we capture the opportunity, how we lift the workforce and create the opportunities, and how we tackle the global agenda and compete globally. And also to reflect on what we're doing for the ones who have more challenges adapting. And you're right that there are many options with learning that have not been developed yet that we need to work on. And if this country doesn't do it, I'm not sure which country can do it. So all of us have a responsibility in that thinking, in our own organizations and how we serve our clients. So merci également à nos partenaires, Via Rail, le Conseil canadien des affaires, Secrétariat du Conseil du Trésor du Canada et CIPAC. And a little bit of housekeeping for this evening dinner and lecture. As the shuttle or your staff needs to reset the room for our dinner, I invite you to join us for a reception in the lobby just outside this room. Note that your table number will be the same for dinner this evening, so we will open the room again, the doors again at 6:45. Merci, bon cocktail, à bientôt.